On the afternoon of May 5, 1993, West Memphis, Arkansas, was moving at its usual pace. A town of fewer than 30,000 people, it straddled the Mississippi River, a place where most families knew each other by name, and children rode their bikes freely down cracked sidewalks. But that ordinary Wednesday would mark the beginning of one of the most infamous criminal cases in American history. That evening, three boys, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, all second graders, failed to return home. They were last seen together riding bikes in their neighborhood near an area locals called Robin Hood Hills, a patch of dense woods and drainage ditches tucked behind the interstate. At first, their absence stirred concern but not panic. After all, in a working-class town where many parents worked long hours, kids often roamed the streets until nightfall. But as the sun sank and the boys still hadn't returned, fear began to take hold. By nightfall, the boys' parents were frantic. Calls went out to neighbors, friends, and the police. Families walked the neighborhoods with flashlights, shouting the boys' names into the humid Arkansas night. Pam Hobbs, Stevie Branch's mother, later recalled the dread that crept into her chest as the minutes stretched into hours. Something was terribly wrong. West Memphis police began a search, but it was limited at first. Officers swept through the immediate neighborhoods and fields, but decided against combing Robin Hood Hills in the dark. The wooded area was difficult terrain, a tangle of trees, ditches, and undergrowth that could easily trip up even seasoned searchers. They would return in the morning. The following day, May 6th, would forever sear itself into the town's memory. As daylight broke, searchers fanned out again, combing through the woods, ditches, and creek beds of Robin Hood Hills. Around 1:45 p.m., a searcher named Steve Jones, a juvenile parole officer volunteering to help, spotted a child's sneaker floating in a muddy ditch. When officers pushed deeper into the water, what they found shocked even hardened law enforcement. The bodies of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers were discovered submerged in a drainage ditch, stripped of clothing, their hands tied to their feet with shoelaces. The scene was gruesome, unlike anything the community had ever experienced. Christopher Byers had suffered additional injuries, including mutilation, which fueled the immediate suspicion that the killings were ritualistic in nature. News of the discovery spread quickly, and by evening, the entire town seemed gripped by a suffocating mix of grief and terror. For parents in West Memphis, it was the unthinkable nightmare. Children brutally murdered in their own neighborhood, in a place they thought was safe. The police, under immense pressure, sealed off the crime scene and began gathering evidence. But the investigation was plagued from the beginning. The wooded area was trampled by volunteers, officers, and curious onlookers, contaminating what could have been critical forensic clues. Evidence collection was chaotic, and procedures often fell short of professional standards. By the time the bodies were removed from Robin Hood Hills, the community was already desperate for answers. Parents clutched their children tighter that night, while whispers of something dark and sinister moving through their town began to grow. West Memphis, like many parts of America in the early 1990s, was caught in the wave of satanic panic, a widespread fear that occult cults were secretly operating, abducting, and harming children. The brutality of the boys' deaths seemed, at least to some, to fit that narrative. Television reports fueled speculation. Anchor voices described the murders as ritualistic and satanic long before any forensic pathologist weighed in. Residents whispered in grocery stores, in church pews, in parking lots, "Who could have done this?" Theories bloomed in the vacuum of evidence. Many were wild, others cruel, and all shared one thing in common: they were born out of fear. For the families of the victims, grief quickly collided with the pressure of media attention. Cameras swarmed the small homes where the boys had lived, and reporters thrust microphones at parents still raw with shock. While some sought privacy, others, like Christopher Byers' stepfather, John Mark Byers, leaned into the cameras, weeping openly, his booming voice declaring that he wanted justice at any cost. The tragedy of the murders didn't just ripple through the families. It altered the fabric of West Memphis itself. This was not a city accustomed to national headlines. Suddenly, residents felt exposed, watched by the world. The killings became not just a crime but a test of faith, of justice, and of identity for an entire community. And within days, the direction of the investigation began to shift. Police weren't just searching for killers. They were searching for monsters, an enemy that, in the eyes of many, might be hiding in plain sight. The stage was now set for a case that would become one of the most controversial in modern American criminal history, built as much on rumor, fear, and cultural hysteria as on hard evidence. The tragedy of 3 young boys had torn open a wound in West Memphis, and the way that wound would be treated would shape the fate of 3 other boys, teenagers who would soon be known as the West Memphis Three. You're watching Trace of Evil, where we reveal true crimes, unsolved disappearances, and mysteries surrounding crime. Like and subscribe to watch more episodes from our channel. Let's get back into the story of the West Memphis Three. The discovery of the 3 boys' bodies in Robin Hood Hills left police scrambling for leads. But with little physical evidence and a shaken community demanding swift justice, investigators soon found themselves leaning on something far less concrete: narrative. The brutality of the crime seemed too extreme for any ordinary explanation, and almost immediately, detectives began to frame the murders through the lens of the satanic panic gripping America at the time. West Memphis was a deeply religious, Bible Belt community. For years, pastors had preached warnings about rock music, horror movies, and anything perceived as anti-Christian. Stories of cults, ritual sacrifices, and demonic practices weren't just urban legends. They were preached from pulpits, repeated in classrooms, and whispered among neighbors. Against this backdrop, the killings of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers seemed to fit a terrifying template. Investigators began narrowing their gaze not on known criminals but on outsiders, young men in town whose appearance or interests set them apart. Chief among them was Damien Echols, an 18-year-old high school dropout who dressed in black, read Stephen King novels, and was fascinated by Wicca and other non-mainstream religions. Echols, with his long hair and dark clothing, was already known to police for minor offenses and his reputation as the weird kid. To police under pressure, he was an easy fit for their working theory: a ritual killing carried out by someone dabbling in the occult. Alongside Echols, authorities began watching his friends, Jason Baldwin, a quiet 16-year-old who shared Damien's interest in heavy metal, and Jessie Misskelley, a 17-year-old with an intellectual disability. Jessie, with an IQ of 72, struggled with comprehension and reasoning. To detectives, however, he represented something different: a possible weak link who could be pushed into providing a confession. Meanwhile, the physical investigation floundered. Evidence from the crime scene had been compromised early on. Fibers, footprints, and other trace materials were either missed or poorly documented. Even the bindings on the boys' shoelaces, taken from their own sneakers, offered no usable fingerprints or DNA. Without hard forensic leads, the case leaned further into speculation. Then came the breakthrough police thought they needed. On June 3rd, less than a month after the murders, detectives brought Jessie Misskelley in for questioning. What followed would become one of the most controversial interrogations in modern criminal history. Over the course of 12 hours, much of it unrecorded, Misskelley was interrogated, pressured, and fed details of the crime. Detectives asked leading questions, corrected him when his answers didn't align, and circled back until his statements matched the narrative they were building. In the end, Jessie gave a taped confession that placed himself, Damien, and Jason at the scene of the murders. He described how the boys were lured, beaten, sexually assaulted, and killed in a satanic ritual. But the confession was riddled with errors. Jessie claimed the murders took place in the morning, when school records proved the boys were in class. He misidentified the clothing the victims wore. His timeline didn't match witness accounts. And yet, for investigators desperate to close the case, the confession was enough. News of the arrest spread like wildfire. For many in West Memphis, the case now made sense. 3 strange teenagers, dabbling in witchcraft and heavy metal, had sacrificed 3 innocent children. In the climate of fear and religious fervor, this explanation felt almost inevitable. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Defense attorneys, journalists, and a handful of community members quickly pointed out the glaring issues with the case. No physical evidence tied Damien, Jason, or Jessie to the crime scene. The so-called satanic elements, such as the bindings and injuries, could just as easily have been explained by the natural environment of the ditch and animal predation. And Jessie's confession, when scrutinized, looked less like a statement of guilt and more like the product of coercion. Despite this, prosecutors pushed forward. They leaned heavily on Jessie's words, even though he would later recant, and on the testimony of dubious witnesses who claimed Damien had bragged about the murders. The narrative of satanic ritual became the prosecution's strongest weapon, a tool designed not just to present evidence but to play to the fears of the jury. For Damien, Jason, and Jessie, the tide had turned. What began as whispers of suspicion had hardened into formal charges of capital murder. And as the summer of 1993 wore on, the West Memphis Three found themselves staring down the machinery of a justice system that, for many, seemed less concerned with truth than with closure. The small town that had once been defined by its quiet neighborhoods and blue-collar rhythms was now a battleground between grief, fear, and the pursuit of justice. The weight of 3 lost boys hung over everything. And in the push to resolve that tragedy, West Memphis seemed ready to sacrifice 3 more. The trials ahead would reveal just how fragile the line between justice and hysteria could be, and how far a community and a legal system would go to convince itself it had found the truth. The arrests of Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley marked only the beginning of a saga that would capture national attention. With 3 suspects in custody, the stage shifted to the courtroom, where the murders of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers would be tried not just as a criminal case, but as a spectacle steeped in fear, imagery, and emotion. The state chose to split the proceedings. Jessie Misskelley, whose taped confession had launched the case, would stand trial first. Prosecutors knew his statement was riddled with contradictions, but they also knew it carried enormous weight in the court of public opinion. Playing the tape in front of a jury offered a powerful narrative, a first-hand account of the crime. Yet the defense countered that Jessie's words were coerced. They highlighted his limited intellectual capacity and argued he had been manipulated by detectives. Experts pointed out that his confession contained multiple inaccuracies that should have raised red flags. But in the tense climate of West Memphis, the nuances mattered less than the impression the tape created. The jury found Jessie guilty of 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life plus 40 years. With Jessie convicted, prosecutors turned their sights on Damien and Jason. Their joint trial became the centerpiece of the case, drawing reporters, activists, and curious onlookers to the courthouse. For many in the community, the proceedings felt less like a legal process and more like a moral reckoning, a fight between good and evil. The prosecution leaned heavily on symbolism. Damien's clothing, his journals, and even his reading material were introduced as evidence of his supposed occult practices. A psychiatrist testified that Damien exhibited sociopathic tendencies and a fascination with witchcraft. Jason, though quieter and less central to the state's case, was portrayed as a loyal follower drawn into Damien's dark world. But what the case lacked in physical evidence, it compensated for in spectacle. Witnesses were called to testify about overheard conversations where Damien allegedly bragged about the killings. Others described seeing the teens near Robin Hood Hills, though their accounts often shifted under scrutiny. A knife recovered from a lake behind Jason Baldwin's home was presented as a possible murder weapon, even though forensic analysis provided no conclusive link. For the defense, the challenge was immense. How could they dismantle not only the prosecution's case, but the broader narrative that painted their clients as satanic killers? They argued the state's evidence was circumstantial at best, and highlighted the lack of DNA, fingerprints, or any direct forensic connection to the crime. They pointed to Jessie's unreliable confession and questioned the credibility of witnesses who often had their own motivations for testifying. Yet time and again, the defense found itself battling against something far more powerful than facts: the fear saturating the courtroom. The idea of ritualistic murder, amplified by the era's obsession with satanic cults, overshadowed rational debate. Jurors, already exposed to months of rumors and speculation, entered the trial carrying the weight of community outrage. As the trial wore on, Damien became the focal point. His demeanor, sometimes calm, sometimes defiant, was interpreted in starkly different ways. Supporters saw a teenager overwhelmed by the enormity of his situation. Critics saw arrogance, even evil. His interest in dark literature and his rebellious persona made him an easy target for prosecutors eager to paint him as a monster. The climax of the trial came when prosecutors pieced together a story that, though thin on evidence, carried emotional force. 3 outcast teenagers, bonded by their fascination with the occult, had lured 3 boys into the woods, tied them up, and slaughtered them in a ritualistic frenzy. It was a narrative designed not to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, but to resonate with the fears and beliefs of the jury. The verdict was devastating. Jason Baldwin was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Damien Echols, portrayed as the ringleader, was sentenced to death. The decision ensured the West Memphis Three would spend their lives behind bars, or in Damien's case, face the death chamber. But even as the gavel came down, questions lingered. Why had the state relied so heavily on symbolism and innuendo rather than physical proof? Why were alternative suspects, including some with criminal records and closer ties to the victims, not pursued with the same vigor? And how had a case so fragile in evidence resulted in the most severe of sentences? For the families of the murdered boys, the convictions provided a sense of closure, but not without controversy. Some parents remained convinced the right men were behind bars. Others expressed quiet doubts, troubled by the lack of concrete proof. For the broader public, the trial left a haunting impression. Had justice truly been served, or had 3 more lives been sacrificed to satisfy the demand for resolution? As Damien was sent to death row and Jason and Jessie to life sentences, the case seemed settled in the eyes of the law. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Journalists, filmmakers, and advocates were already beginning to dig into the inconsistencies. The seeds of doubt were being planted, seeds that would one day grow into a movement that changed everything. The guilty verdicts against Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley seemed to cement the state's version of events. In the eyes of the court, justice had been served. 3 teenagers convicted of the brutal murders of 3 children. For many in West Memphis, the case was closed. But outside the courtroom, doubts had already begun to take shape, and soon, they would swell into a movement too loud to ignore. The first cracks appeared not in legal filings but in the lens of a camera. In 1996, the HBO documentary Paradise Lost. The child murders at Robin Hood Hills aired to national audiences. The filmmakers, Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky, had been granted extraordinary access to the trials, capturing raw courtroom footage, interviews, and intimate moments with both the families of the victims and the accused. What they uncovered wasn't just a retelling of the case. It was an exposé of its flaws. Viewers watched as Jessie Misskelley's confession, so central to the prosecution's case, unraveled under scrutiny. They saw how Damien's taste in music and clothing were wielded as weapons in court, transforming a teenager's rebellion into supposed proof of murder. They heard the inconsistencies in witness testimony and the absence of forensic evidence. The documentary didn't claim to solve the crime, but it laid bare the fragility of the state's case. Paradise Lost ignited a storm. For the first time, millions outside of Arkansas were introduced to the West Memphis Three. Letters of support poured in. Donations followed. And with them came a new wave of advocates determined to fight for the teenagers' release. Among the earliest and most vocal supporters were musicians. Heavy metal bands, who themselves had long been scapegoated during the Satanic Panic, saw echoes of their own struggles in the case. Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam, Natalie Maines of the Dixie Chicks, and even Johnny Depp lent their voices and platforms to raise awareness. Benefit concerts were organized. T-shirts bearing the words, "Free the West Memphis Three," appeared at music festivals. What had begun as a local tragedy was transforming into an international cause. But celebrity attention wasn't the only force challenging the convictions. Behind the scenes, attorneys and independent investigators began re-examining the evidence. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, advances in DNA testing opened new doors. Samples collected from the crime scene were retested, and the results were damning. Not to Damien, Jason, or Jessie, but to the prosecution's narrative. None of the DNA matched the convicted teens. Instead, one sample was linked to a hair consistent with Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of victim Stevie Branch. Though the evidence was circumstantial, it added weight to the idea that investigators may have pursued the wrong suspects. Advocates argued that the state had ignored or minimized leads pointing to alternative suspects in their rush to close the case. Why, for example, had they not fully investigated Hobbs or other individuals with histories of violence? Why had physical evidence that could have exonerated the teens been overlooked? The more people looked, the shakier the foundation became. Jessie's confession, once touted as ironclad, was increasingly recognized as unreliable. Experts in false confessions pointed out that his intellectual limitations made him highly susceptible to suggestion. Court transcripts revealed just how aggressively detectives had led him during questioning, feeding him details that later appeared in his statement. What once seemed like insider knowledge now looked more like a script written under duress. Meanwhile, Damien Echols languished on death row, his mental and physical health deteriorating. Yet even from a cell, he became a voice for the movement. Through letters and interviews, he described the bleak conditions of solitary confinement, the despair of wrongful conviction, and his unshaken insistence on innocence. His words humanized the West Memphis Three in ways the courtroom never had. By the early 2000s, the campaign for their freedom had grown into a global network. Websites chronicled updates, investigative journalists published exposés, and legal teams filed motion after motion. Each development added fuel to the fire. A second and third Paradise Lost documentary kept the story alive, ensuring the case never faded from public memory. For the state of Arkansas, however, the mounting pressure was a double-edged sword. On one hand, the courts resisted reopening the case, wary of admitting failure. On the other hand, the weight of public opinion and the advancements in forensic science made it increasingly difficult to ignore. Appeals were denied, motions rejected, and yet, cracks widened with each passing year. What began in 1993 as a closed investigation had become, by the 2000s, one of the most scrutinized criminal cases in American history. The West Memphis Three were no longer just convicted killers, they were symbols. Symbols of a justice system swayed by fear. Symbols of a community consumed by hysteria. Symbols of how easily truth can be lost when narrative takes the place of evidence. And yet, for all the documentaries, celebrity campaigns, and DNA revelations, Damien, Jason, and Jessie remained behind bars. Hope grew, but so did frustration. The fight for their freedom had gained momentum, but the system that put them there showed no signs of undoing its verdict. Still, the cracks in the foundation were undeniable. Something was shifting, and the question was no longer whether the world believed in their innocence. It was whether the state of Arkansas was willing to act on it. The breakthrough came not from the courts themselves, but from a compromise born of political and legal pressure. In 2011, nearly 18 years after their arrests, prosecutors and defense attorneys sat down to negotiate a way out. The state of Arkansas was facing mounting criticism, fueled by DNA results that excluded the defendants and by years of public advocacy. But for officials, admitting the convictions were wrongful threatened to undermine the credibility of the justice system. A middle ground was needed, and it came in the form of the Alford plea. The Alford plea is a rare legal device. It allows defendants to maintain their innocence while acknowledging that the prosecution has enough evidence to secure a conviction. For Damien, Jason, and Jessie, it represented both opportunity and bitter compromise. Freedom in exchange for never being fully exonerated. On August 19, 2011, the three men were led into a crowded courtroom. Cameras rolled as the deal was read aloud. One by one, they stood before the judge and entered their pleas. The emotions in the room were raw and conflicted. For supporters, this was the long-awaited moment of release. For the men themselves, it was liberation tinged with injustice. Jason Baldwin later revealed he had resisted the plea at first. To him, accepting it meant conceding ground to a system that had wronged them. But with Damien facing execution on death row, Baldwin agreed. "I couldn't let him die," Jason explained. That decision sealed the deal. When the paperwork was signed, the West Memphis Three walked free. Outside the courthouse, they were met with cheers, tears, and flashing cameras. After nearly 2 decades, the young men who had entered prison as teenagers emerged into a world transformed by technology, culture, and time. They were free, but freedom came with conditions. Their convictions technically still stood. The state maintained its narrative, and the men carried the burden of being labeled guilty in the eyes of the law. For Damien Echols, the adjustment was especially stark. Years on death row had left deep scars, both physical and psychological. He described struggling with sunlight after so long in confinement, his eyes unable to adjust. His health had deteriorated from years in isolation, and his mind bore the marks of trauma. Yet he also found a renewed voice, writing books and speaking publicly about the injustice he endured. Jason Baldwin pursued education and advocacy, working on criminal justice reform and supporting other wrongful conviction cases. Jessie Misskelley, less inclined to public life, retreated into relative quiet, his struggles with intellectual disability making reintegration into society uniquely challenging. The release sparked debates that continue to this day. For many, the Alford plea was a pragmatic solution to an impossible problem, a way to free 3 men without forcing the state to admit fault. But for others, it was a bitter reminder of a system unwilling to take responsibility. By avoiding exoneration, Arkansas protected itself from lawsuits and accountability, leaving the question of who really killed Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers unresolved. The victims' families remained divided. Some believed justice had been miscarried and still saw Damien, Jason, and Jessie as the killers. Others, influenced by the documentaries and new evidence, admitted doubt. The lack of closure kept the community fractured, caught between competing narratives of guilt and innocence. In the years since their release, the West Memphis Three case has become a touchstone in discussions of wrongful convictions. It highlights the dangers of moral panic, the unreliability of coerced confessions, and the consequences of letting public fear dictate justice. It also illustrates the limits of reform. Even when the flaws of a case are exposed, the system often resists admitting error. Damien, Jason, and Jessie remain free, but the shadow of Robin Hood Hills lingers. The true perpetrators of the 1993 murders have never been conclusively identified. DNA evidence points in new directions, but no one else has ever been tried. For the families of Stevie, Michael, and Christopher, the absence of answers is its own kind of prison. The story of the West Memphis Three is not just about 3 young men wrongfully convicted. It is about a town consumed by fear, a justice system driven by narrative over evidence, and a tragedy that continues to echo decades later. Their release was a triumph of persistence, advocacy, and public pressure. But it was also a compromise that left no one truly satisfied. Freedom came, yes, but at a price. A price paid not only by Damien, Jason, and Jessie, but by 3 little boys whose murders remain, at their core, unsolved. And so, the case of the West Memphis Three endures as one of America's most haunting legal and moral questions. Was justice ever served? Or was the need for closure so strong that truth became the first casualty?